Welcome back. You probably noticed a new introduction video, and that's because this video is dropping the day that Powerlifting Now has officially launched. If you watched my last video or if you've been following along on Instagram, you'd know Powerlifting Now is a collaborative business between myself, Sean Noriega, Matt Cronin, and Marcellus Williams. And our goal is to bring you the most up-to-date information on powerlifting, from technique to programming to nutrition to game day strategy to sports psychology to attempt selection. Every aspect of powerlifting we're going to be discussing in this new platform. So what is this platform? It's going to be a monthly subscription service. We're going to have a website that I'll be linking below that you can sign up for a membership. And with our launch today, we'll be running a pre-sale offer up until February 1st, where the platform of Powerlifting Now will officially be live. What you can expect is 20 to 40 minute videos from each one of us monthly, talking about various topics, as well as a roundtable podcast discussion where we'll either be bringing topics ourselves to the discussion to be able to go back and forth between coaches, or we'll be taking subscriber submitted questions to be able to go over, because everyone who is going to be a subscriber to Powerlifting Now is also going to be available to be part of our Discord server where you can interact with us. We'll have different options and groups within that where we can be able to interact with our subscribers, answer questions from you, and be able to field questions that we'll use in future videos and also future podcasts. Our goal as this platform expands is also to bring on other content creators in the powerlifting realm to be able to provide additional videos, merchandising. We'll also be adding in free programs within the Powerlifting Now platform to really create an all-encompassing area where you can come to get the best powerlifting information available online or anywhere that's readily available. And to give you a little sneak peek into what the first month is going to be like, Sean Noriega is going to be covering how to arch on the bench press, the video we've been waiting for forever that he's promised 3 years ago, and it's finally going to be released February 1st. I am going to be talking about movement constraints and how we can use those to improve and cue our technique. Marcellus is going to discuss how to control which days are the strongest within programming. And then Matt Cronin is going to be discussing heels versus flats in the squat and which you should be using based off of different variables. For those who have been my longtime YouTube subscribers, I'll still be uploading here, but if you want even more content from me and you want consistent content from all four of us, Powerlifting Now is going to be the place to be able to get that in a low-cost subscription-based model. And like I said, we're starting February 1st. But today is the official launch of the pre-sale. So we're gonna have an option that is only gonna be available for the next 2 weeks up until February 1st. And then we're gonna be going to our normal pricing and options. So I'm going to include the link below of where you can go to get all of that information on how to sign up. And I hope all of you are as excited as I am to be able to provide this to the powerlifting community and to provide you all with the best content in powerlifting from some of the best coaches in the game. So now to get into our topic for today, it's going to be how to stop over-wedging on the deadlift. And to give some context here, I've had 3 other videos I've talked about on deadlift. One was talking about the initial setup, one was talking more about slack pull, and then the video I just released, just recently, talking about a simple cue of how to hinge. Those are precursors to this video because there are many reasons why someone might over-wedge, and a lot of the reasons usually stem back to issues with technique and positioning. This video is with the assumption that your technique and positioning actually is pretty darn good and that you've watched those videos to understand much of my technique recommendations, versus this video is going to look at, okay, you're doing most things right, but you still are in a sense over-wedging. So what do I mean by that in the context of this video? What I mean is typically over-wedging without the presence of some significant positional issues is when you are in some manner shifting your center of mass forward. And that can lead to a multitude of different issues. If you watch my defining what is good technique, the foundation of good technique outside of meeting requirements for powerlifting rules is maintaining your center of mass as best as possible. That's just laws of gravity and physics. We want to be able to maintain our center of mass because that's where we're going to be able to produce force in the most efficient manner. I'd say on average, what I'm going to talk about on this video typically happens a bit more on the sumo deadlift, but it definitely can apply to conventional as well. And I'll help to kind of differentiate that with some of the topics, as some of the mistakes I'm going to be talking about that people make are very much sumo based, and some are definitely applicable to both in the sense of sumo and conventional. So with that background, I see 6 common mistakes people make in regards to the sumo and conventional deadlift with the assumption that for the most part, they have good habits with their setup and their technique, but they still, for some reason, tend to shift their center of mass forward. And many of these mistakes go hand in hand. Just like if you watch many of my other videos, a lot of times when you have one mistake, it's correlating or the effect of another mistake. So even though I'm going to cover these individually, you may be stacking them together and need to look at the root cause of, okay, why are these multiple mistakes happening and which one is really the root cause of why this exists? So what are these mistakes? Number one, the distance you have to wedge is too far. Number two, you're spending too much time holding the bar and setting up. Number three, when you're tensioning and pulling slack, you're doing so with some type of flexion with the back, which necessarily isn't wrong. I'll cover that in a bit. But as you then wedge, you have to extend. Number four, you're too over your midfoot in the setup. Number five, something in regards to your stance width versus your foot angle is causing that center of mass to shift forward. And then number six, you're trying to be too upright, which typically is a mistake caused by head or neck position. So in this video, we're going to take a look at those 6 mistakes as well as touch on a couple other technique cues that I will use that can be applicable to all 6 mistakes to be able to summarize this and be able to help you stop over wedging, maintain your center of mass better, and be more efficient in your sumo or conventional deadlift. So the first mistake we're going to look at is having too far of a distance to wedge. And this can apply to both sumo and conventional, but I would say is more of an issue with sumo deadlift. So most of my demonstration will be with sumo on this specific example. I do want to say a caveat. Every single mistake I am going to talk about could be a non-issue. This could be exactly how you set up and you have zero issue with it. It's just that once we get to the minute details of technique and trying to optimize it to create the most efficient way to produce force, some people will do exactly what I'm talking about in this video and have zero issue, and some people will do it and it will lead to some type of mistakes or issue with their center of mass. So just because you do this doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just, does it create a center of mass issue for you? So what do I mean by distance to wedge? So if I am setting up in the sumo deadlift and I have my hips way, way, way back and I have to go from basically straight legs to all the way into position, I have a pretty far distance to wedge. And the further the distance, frankly, just the more that can go wrong, because the more we have to change joint angles, as well as, especially if you're speedy and you're not as patient with the wedge, the more difficult it is and the more effort has to be put in to decelerate that wedge. And so a lot of these examples I'm going to exaggerate, but what we see too often is we have this long distance and you see someone pull in and they're going to kick the bar forward or shift into their toes because they are not able to decelerate and stop over their midfoot position. They continue to travel past it. And like I said, maybe for some people it's zero issue at all, but it's a common thing I see where people shift their center of mass forward. It's because they have a very far distance to wedge. Too much can go wrong during that period of time, and they tend to struggle with decelerating that wedge speed and stopping in that exact position over their midfoot to be able to pull. So those lifters a lot of times will benefit from a shorter wedge. From instead of having this elongated straight leg long distance, they're going to do better if they have a very short wedge position, because it's much easier to control that wedge and that positioning to stop where we need to be if we're having a shorter distance to do so. The next mistake I see people make is people spending too much time holding the bar and setting up. And I'd say this one's universal. This is one that everyone would need to likely improve. As once you grab the bar, if you've watched my past videos, it's time to lift. The setup and all of the positional requirements are done before grabbing the bar. Once you grab the bar, you want to lift. And so this probably applies a little bit more to sumo, but not because of the sumo deadlift, but because it's more of typically a hook grip situation. With mixed grip, it's pretty simple. You go down, most people don't have any issue. They grab the bar, they wedge in, they pull. They usually don't spend an elongated amount of time messing with their grip and their setup at the bottom. Versus hook grip, you constantly see, I'm going to show sumo because, again, most people who hook grip tend to be sumo deadlifters. They'll get down here and they'll set their grip, they'll set their grip, they'll set their grip, and they'll do it over and over and over. And every single time they set their grip, they start to lose position to where then when they finally wedge in, the position that they were trying to create in the first place is gone because they start to overthink about their grip and let that be the overriding cueing that they're thinking about during the actual initiation of the movement, versus all of the joint angles and center of mass distribution that frankly matters a little bit more. And if you follow me on Instagram, I am a big proponent of mixed grip. I have no issue with hook. I just tend to think it tends to be overdone, especially on stiff bar pullers. Deadlift bar is a little bit of a different issue. Maybe that's a topic we'll be discussing on Powerlifting Now. I'm sure it will be. But showing again, as I already alluded to, why this is an issue. If let's say I'm gonna hook grip no matter what. If I set up, I'm gonna get in position, I'm ready to go, I hook, I pull. I'm able to do a lot better job of managing those positions I set up in my initial setup before grabbing the bar. I didn't waste my time at the bar. What tends to happen too much, not for everyone, but too often, is people do the right things. They get in position, they hook, they hook, they hook, and every single time, you likely can see it in the video, the positions I am having from the knee joint to the hip joint to the back start changing. And so what we then see is, because of that, my hips, I know for a fact, I can feel it, have traveled closer to the bar. And so as I go to pull and try and get into the same position that I normally would, it now is going to shift my center of mass forward, because my hips started too close to the bar in the first place, so that now when the hips shift forward, they are overly shifted forward, they shift me into my toes, and I've changed my center of mass distribution. So how do we fix this? You got to speed up your setup when you grab the bar. If you are a hook grip puller, and that is for sure what is the most optimal way for you to grip the bar, I would definitely check out Sean Noriega's tutorial on hook grip. He honestly is probably one of the best lifters I know of when it comes to just grabbing the bar and going. That's what most hook grip pullers need to do. They need to grab the bar and lift versus overly setting up their hook grip. The other option is, if you are a hook grip puller and you're just doing it because someone said it was the best way to do it, you may experiment with mixed grip. But either way, you need to speed up your setup. You need to get into a position, and then once you decide to grab the bar, that's when you're deciding to lift. That's not the continuation of your setup. This is my setup. I'm ready to go, and as soon as I go to grab the bar, I'm going to go into my lift so I can continue to manage those joint angles and my center of mass. The next mistake is that someone is tensioning with some type of flexion in their back, and then as they actually go to wedge and pull, they start to extend. And this can be as equal of an issue on sumo deadlift or conventional, and honestly, it tends to go a lot of times with the previous mistake of spending too much time at the bar. But either way, it can go with any of those issues, and there's a lot of reasons why this can happen. I'm actually going to demonstrate this one conventional because it's actually a little bit easier to see because of the shin angle. So a precursor to this that I already kind of discussed when I talked about setting up with the bar is that our hips have to be in a certain position before we wedge. We have to have a certain distance between our hips and in a sense the bar or our shoulders, and that's the moment arm that is required. So what I mean by that is this right here with a neutral back position is where my hips have to be for my shoulders to be over the bar, which, as a precursor, if you watch my other videos, we need those shoulders or shoulder blades to be directly over the bar, because if they're not, that bar is either going to fly out, or if I'm behind it, I'm going to shift forward. You're going to have to be in a position where the shoulders and or shoulder blades, or armpits you could say, are directly over the bar. And then based on your specific leverages, that means your hips are going to have to be in a certain position. And now, one thing I want to talk about before getting further into this is a rounded back is not an issue necessarily. That's not what I'm trying to say. I have plenty of people who pull with a rounded back. I have some people who start with a rounded back and continue with a rounded back. That is not the point. My point is the people who start in their setup with a rounded back and then try to extend as they wedge, because here is what happens. If, based on my leverages, to get my shoulders directly over the bar and have my back neutral, this is the position my hips need to be in. I can start here and then I wedge. That's where my hips have to be. It's just based on my leverages, that's the position. It's different for everyone, but if you go through the general patterns of a hinge-based setup, shoulders over the bar and staying over your midfoot, you're gonna find where you need to be. If I start and I have a lack of hinge, which goes back to my last video of the easy cueing, which is why this is a precursor to this video, is how to hinge, because it's very, very important. And specifically with this mistake, if I don't hinge, let's say I just reach down to the bar. My shoulders are over the bar, but two, my hips are way closer to the bar. They're probably they're already where they need to be. So to get my shoulders over the bar, I'm going to have to wedge. But look what then happens to my center of mass. It shifts forward, the bar shifts forward because the hips were too close, and then as I wedge, they scoot even closer. So what do people do instead? They, to sometimes fix that issue, they will extend as they wedge in, but that's very inefficient. We don't want to be having to go through unneeded joint movement as we're wedging. We want the knee joint and the hip joint to be really the only joints that are having to do anything during this process, as well as a very typical issue people have when they start with that rounded position and trying to extend as they wedge is they start to have to let go of slack to drop their body. Because if I'm rounded over, my hips are higher than they should be, in a sense. They're closer and they're higher because I'm letting myself, because if I have to straighten my back, you can see here, my hips have to drive back and they have to drop a bit to get in that same position with the shoulders over the bar. So what usually has to happen is we're trying to create this vertical tension upwards to pull that slack. Well, as we extend, as we wedge in, we have to drop. And even though I'm trying to maintain that slack, you probably can't see it from that angle, my elbows start to kind of bend a little bit because they're kind of letting off tension because I'm having to change position as I go to wedge in. So there's just a lot of things that can go wrong as we do this because it's just an inefficient way to change our joint angle during the wedge. We don't want to have to worry about flexion and extension with the back. Like I said, if you pull with a rounded back and you're always going to pull with a rounded back, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm simply talking about is if you are going to pull with a more neutral position, but you start rounded and you try to extend coming down, we want to create a better hinge to begin with. Hence the last video, thumbs, middle finger, hinge, get those hips back. And then I can wedge in and be able to create the proper tension, maintain my center of mass, and not shift forward as I pull. The next mistake is people setting up too much over their midfoot. And that sounds kind of hypocritical because that's what we're talking about is being over your midfoot. But probably even more so in the sumo deadlift, even though it does apply to both, a lot of people tend to benefit from starting a bit heel heavy and wedging into their midfoot. Because what happens with some people is that they are very midfoot dominant, like you would think you should be. They get in their position, they're over their midfoot, and when they wedge, there tends to be this shift of mass because that's the direction our body is heading. As I talked about, this can go hand in hand with some other things. This very much, a lot of times, goes hand in hand with the too great of a distance. When we have a really, really far distance to wedge and we start midfoot and when we go down, we tend to not decelerate and stop in the position we want to, and we tend to overshift forward, which, as I discussed, if you have both of these issues, maybe this is more the issue and it's completely fine that you have that greater distance, but you need to think about starting with your center of mass back more. It could be one or the other. It's not black and white of which one's the issue. It's something you got to kind of diagnose and figure out. But if this is an issue, what you want to think about is during your setup, being a bit heel heavy. So right now I feel pretty heavy into my heels. I'm loose on my toes and feel them kind of floating a bit. And so as I go to slack pull and then wedge, as I wedge in, I shift into my midfoot. Versus the opposite, like I said, if I start in this very far back hip position, I'm over my midfoot. You can even see here, like if I'm over my midfoot, my shoulders have to be in front of the bar, and too often we then meet where those shoulders are. Versus if I get back onto my heels a bit more, I can keep my shoulders over the bar, I create that position, create this fulcrum that I rotate around, and then wedge into that midfoot position. And like I said, the same can go for conventional, albeit I see it less commonly being an issue, is you might need to be a bit heel heavy as you wedge, and then as you pull in to the bar, you shift from that heel to midfoot versus being heavy into the midfoot and then finding yourself shifting from the midfoot to your toes. The next issue is more so sumo related. And where we run into issues with sumo is our stance width and foot angle tend to correlate. The wider we are, the more we're going to tend to angle out our feet. The closer we are, the more the feet are going to be straight forward, as it's going to create kind of a directionality of where the femurs and our stance width is going to go. And what we find with some people is that maybe they go super wide and point their feet too straight forward. And when they go to drive their legs out, they just don't have any room to be able to drive and abduct and externally rotate. And so where do the shins have to go? They have to go forward into the bar. They can't open up and go out. The same thing somewhat applies to the narrow stance. If we're really narrow and we rotate our feet way out, our knees aren't going to go that direction. They want to go forward, and what tends to happen is our foot tends, when our knees drive, the direction of those knees are going to pronate and roll that foot inwards, which always isn't a bad thing. But in this case, what I'm discussing is it rotates it forward, shifts the center of mass of the foot, and we get a little bit too far onto our toes. So it's important, specifically on the sumo deadlift, to be able to match that foot angle to the stance width based on your individual leverages. This isn't going to be a video on how to determine that stance width or foot angle, because that could be an entire video within itself. But in some matter, based on your anthropomics, you're going to have a desired foot angle and stance width that is optimal for you. If you go too wide and your feet point forward, what you're gonna find too often is those shins are gonna kick forward and push into the bar and shift the center of mass forward. And just like I said, if you're too narrow and you point the feet too far out, those knees aren't gonna be able to drive out enough. That foot's gonna rotate forward and pronate in towards the front and kind of towards that inside of the big toe, and you're gonna find you shift your center of mass forward. Versus if we put that foot angle in a more optimal position, and where we can be able to find the adequate room to be able to abduct as well as externally rotate, we're going to find that those shins can be able to travel with that foot angle. They can stack properly in the sense of lateral position, of creating a bit more ground force. And then it's also going to help in that front to back center of mass of making sure we stay over that midfoot. The last common mistake I see people make is trying to be too upright. And I would say that, this can apply to both. But I think this tends to be almost more of an issue sometimes on the conventional deadlift in regards to the center of mass. As I discussed multiple times for this video, everyone has their own individual leverages. Not everyone's gonna pull like Dan Grigsby. You aren't gonna be perfectly upright. You have to pull based on what your leverages entail are the proper joint angles to be able to maintain your center of mass and produce force in the most efficient manner. With that being said, and where I'm gonna cue most of this, is your head position and your neck, your head and your neck position, dictate a lot of what you tend to do with the uprightness. If you can just look here, you can see as I flex and extend the neck, it changes my upper back angle. I can't overly extend my upper back if my chin's tucked and my neck is flexed over. I also can't overly be kyphotic and flex over my upper back if my neck is really extended. So what our neck does, which a lot of times deals with the head, because it's harder to think about the neck, it's a little bit easier to think about the head controlling the neck. What that does tends to dictate a lot. So I'm going to use conventional as an example. In conventional, it is highly likely you're going to be less upright than in sumo. That's just the makeup of the lift. You are going to have more of a hinge pattern on the conventional deadlift than the sumo deadlift. So we are going to be less upright. But if we are consistently trying to pull our head and our chest up, we tend to over wedge and push the bar forward, because what happens is we only have so much degree of extension with the back. And at a certain point, if I try to keep extending, what happens without even me thinking about it is my hips start to pull under me, because instead of continuing to extend at the spine, I then create more uprightness. So what you see a lot of times too often with conventional pullers is they want to mimic the same head position they might use on sumo deadlift. They pull their head and their chest up, they end up dropping their hips too low, they shift their center of mass forward, you can see how I'm kicking the bar forward, and then start to get out of position. So there is no necessarily right and wrong with head position though. Some people are gonna find that's exactly what they need to do. They need to pull their head up, but it's just dependent on the positions that creates with the rest of the joint angles. For me, I tend to look a little bit more at a downward gaze on my conventional deadlift, because that is going to align my head and my neck with that torso angle that is in sense optimal for my leverages. If I was to look more up, I'm going to have to fight with the rest of my body to not overly be upright. The opposite with sumo. On sumo, I can be more upright, so it tends to be a little bit more advantageous for me to look straight forward. If I was to look straight up and overly look up, I'm gonna over wedge there too, most likely. So it really is dependent on each person. You're gonna find some conventional pullers look up and it's completely fine. You're gonna see some sumo pullers look down and it's completely fine. It just depends on what that then adjusts with your torso angle. We just don't want to be too upright, because too upright is not better. It's going to create center of mass issues, and it's going to create leverage issues with the distribution of tension with the knee extensors versus the hip extensors. So those are the 6 common mistakes I've seen. And like I said, for the most part, some people do these things and their positioning and their technique and their strength is great. But for others, it's going to cause, in a sense, over-wedging and a shift forward of their center of mass. Within that, and the things I discussed to be able to solve these issues, there are 2 general rules that apply typically to all of these, and really just deadlift in general. The first one is, when we set up, we typically, for the most part, not everyone, but typically align that bar over our midfoot. That's kind of the point of the starting bar position. If it's too over our toes, we're gonna have the issue that the bar is gonna swing back at us. If it's too far back, we're not even gonna be able to get in position. We're just gonna do some type of RDL. So in some way, based on our leverages, that bar is gonna be in a position that dictates its optimal starting position to have that more vertical bar path, maintain our center of mass, and stay over our midfoot. If that's the case, that bar should never move. So we want to cue that that bar is our stopping point with all of the things we're going to do within our setup. So I'm going to make sure no matter what I do, I'm going to think once my shins touch the bar, that is my stopping point on conventional. And then also when we are in sumo, just because of the relative joint angles with the feet rotated out more, the bar typically is going to be a little bit closer to us. So a lot of times we need to think a little bit more about the knees aren't driving forward and touching the bar and stopping. We think a little bit more about how the knees have to drive out to open up and using that bar as a stopping point. So either or, the bar is the stopping point. The second thing to do is just be patient. All of these things, and especially on deadlift, it's the reason why pause deadlifts tend to be a great variation. If you've watched my top 3 deadlift variations, I explain that in detail. We just need to be patient. The more we rush into that setup, the harder it is to be able to stop and manage the position we want to. So even if you have, like I go back to the first one, you have that far distance wedge, if we're really patient, much easier to stop in that position. And that patience is different for everyone. As you get more and more comfortable with technique and habitual and able to manage those positions, maybe you speed it up. But either way, you just want to be patient with your setup and with your wedging to be able to control these variables to manage your center of mass. So that is how to stop over-wedging in the deadlift, with the context that seemingly all else is completely fine, but you're finding you're still having some type of issue with shifting your center of mass forward from over-wedging during your sumo or conventional deadlift. And through these 6 common mistakes, hopefully you're able to identify which is leading to that issue, and also notating just the general cueing of using that bar as your stopping point and being patient in the wedge to help to be able to apply these to your own lift. And now that you finished the video, make sure, if you haven't already, go check out Powerlifting Now. I'll include the Instagram account and the website powerlifting-now.com, where you can get all the information on how to sign up and be able to sign up for our pre-release launch and our special promotional offer that will only be available until February 1st. And lastly, if you haven't subscribed already, make sure to do so. Give the video a like, give it a share it with your friends, let the powerlifting community as a whole be able to benefit from this. And until next time, peace.